Speaking of Dutch, the next player that I wanted to speak about was Todd Cantwell, because of and also in fact the regular minutes, because I think one thing that a lot of people don't know about Todd Cantwell is that he spent some time in the Netherlands with Fortuna Sittard, very similar to how Mason Mount spent time with Vitesse in the Eredivisie, and I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but before he'd had that loan spell, was there an impression that he could go on to be, go on to have the influence that he did end up having in the Premier League for Norwich, and also this season as well? Was there any indication of that beforehand? And also, what's the future looking like for him? Because I think for a lot of people, he may have dipped off their radar, but is now sort of reappearing because he'll be in that, the very insular Premier League sort of self-interest bubble.
What a way of putting it. Yeah, I think with Todd, he was always incredibly highly thought of coming through the academy. So I think Norwich always felt they had a talented footballer. I think it got to the point where he made his debut against Chelsea at Chelsea in the FA Cup third round replay. People might remember that. And Norwich went out on penalties, but Jamal Lewis scored an equaliser. It was live on BBC, and it was Norwich were in a transition and mid-table and all sorts. There's nothing particularly to write home about here. But Todd came on and he sort of breezed through and had a couple of runs. And you're like, oh, Todd's looking all right at this level, which was the first time obviously it was his debut, so the first time he'd really had a taste of it. And I think at that point there were people in the club thinking, what are we going to do with this guy? Because he's local lad. He's the Dirham Deco is obviously his nickname. Yeah. Don't know why. He's nothing like Deco, but so that's just 15 minutes basically down the road from Norwich. Proper homeboy, lovely family, really well brought up, but quite a home bird. And I think Norwich are like, we need to get him out. We need to get him out of here just to go and grow up a bit. And I think Todd, there was a bit of him wanting to do that as well, but it was a question of where, and he didn't want to just get kicked off the park at League Two, because that would be that basically. So I think it was quite astute sending him to the second division in Holland, because that really, gave him the room to pick the ball up to play it. You watch some of his clips back now, and you can see the shortfalls in it, but you can also see him just growing in confidence of playing a bit of men's football, but also just the growing up of living away from home and being in dorms and his television not working and things like that. I think Norwich's loans manager Neil Adams got a few phone calls to deal with a few things, and it was a bit like, Todd, you got to deal with it yourself, mate. So I think there was a bit of that as well. I think it was Norwich are quite keen on the holistic approach of their players, and especially in development and their academy, and just trying to make sure they're mentally strong enough to deal with what a first team is like. And I think the way Todd came into that Premier League season was remarkable, because he went to Vitesse. He went to Sittard, and then Norwich had the season where they won the championship in 2018-19, and Todd sort of in and around it a lot, but didn't really start a lot of games per se, and was quite in and out. And he was really a peripheral figure to them winning the championship. And there were 3 games at the end of the season where Emi Buendia was suspended, surprise, and Todd came in, and he was just basically being compared to Emi, and he was playing on the right, whereas he's now playing on the left of the 3 behind Teemu. And it didn't work, and he was getting a bit of stick, which I think he probably gets a little bit more because he's a home lad. And I guess, Norwich fans feel like they own a bit more of him than they do players who get bought. So the fact that he then came in for the Premier League season and looked so good from the moment pre-season started, you're like, hello. And I think that was Todd spoken about it as well. It was a real conscious effort for him to do that, to really get his head around it and go for it. And I think you saw that then at the start of the Premier League season. I thought he was as good as any player looked. And probably the end of that season as well, he was taking a degree of responsibility when, to be honest, a lot of it was unraveling around him. But I think the speculation, that's been difficult for him to deal with. I think he'd say that himself. And I think it was quite a confusing period. I think, and then injury niggles to the point where you can only really look at probably November onwards to see Todd really stamping his authority on a championship team. And I think he's been as good as anyone for the rest of that season. Made the position his own. I think he's been helped by having a natural left back of top quality in Demetrius Giannoulis behind him. I think that's made a big difference, and that will obviously be probably a dynamic in the Premier League. But again, how Norwich recruit that, whether they look for a bit more pace and experience as well in one of those attacking roles, may mix it up for Todd. But Daniel Farke loves him. If Todd's available, he plays him, and he really does trust him. I think Todd will always work hard, and he can make things happen. I think he likes trusting in what Todd can do in terms of his ability, and everything's so natural. I find him a really fluid, natural footballer who you coach the bits of the job that he has to do, but the rest of it is like, I want you to express yourself. And he's so good in tight spaces. A lot of his game works really well in the Premier League. And I think when he was in the Premier League last time, he'd have probably seen that he didn't like the idea that people felt he could do it in the Premier League, but the Championship would be a bit of a stretch, whether like physically he couldn't deal with it or whatever. He didn't really like that. And I think he's definitely put that to bed now. He is a top class Championship player, but there are still elements of his game, getting out of tight situations, being able to work the ball in those, and having sort of an awareness as well of, and I think it's an improving awareness of what to do in the final third. I think does mean that he can continue to have an influence in the Premier League level. It was a bit inconsistent in that first season, but I think the amount he's grown up in this year, that does make it quite exciting. But he is in an interesting situation. He's got 2 years effectively on his deal. Norwich are aware they are probably going to have to sell someone if they want more transfer money to spend this year. And we talk about Emmy, and you also talk about who comes in for these players. It will be interesting. I get the impression Todd is really highly thought of, and probably doesn't come with the same baggage maybe that some people feel Emmy might. So it's always interesting talking to people outside of Norwich as to how they view these players, because sometimes it's a little bit different to how people see it this side of the fence. It will be really fascinating with Todd, but he's in a good position. I think if he doesn't go this window, Norwich probably get to the point where they're like, we either have to extend his contract here or work out what we're going to do. So that might be a slightly complicating factor.
Yeah, I think purely from a footballing perspective, I think a lot of the time all this chatter about European Super League and whatnot, and UEFA and FIFA making decisions, I think a lot of the time we forget that football's something we're supposed to enjoy. It's an entertainment product. And Todd Cantwell is one of those players who does make you fall back in love with football. That Manchester City game at Carrow Road, it'll be coming up 2 years now. That was a fantastic game. And I can't even begin to imagine what that must have felt like for the Durham Deco, a local boy doing that for his team. That must have been absolutely sensational. And I think it is a reflection of just the atmosphere. You say it's always interesting to know what the opinions are this side of the fence. I think a lot of people, you may say that, a lot of the time when people think about Norwich, they do a little bit of a shrug. But, I think a lot of people, they'll say, it's a club which does have a real family atmosphere to it. It seems very welcoming to players. You don't tend to get, you don't tend to get awful press if you're a player there and perhaps you're not playing very much. It seems to be a very understanding, nurturing environment.